Hello, travelers, and welcome back to the Tips and Trips podcast, where we explore exciting travel destinations and share insider tips for making the most of your adventures abroad. It is a bright and beautiful, sunny day where I'm at in Canada today, and I'm really feeling those travel vibes, not gonna lie. So in this episode, I'm going to be doing a bit of a destination deep dive, and I chose this specific destination because it was a spot that I visited before I had my YouTube channel. And so now that I'm producing some audio-only content, it just feels like the perfect way to share some more of my stories and knowledge about these beautiful places that I wasn't necessarily able to share with you on video through my vlogs or travel diaries. So in this episode, I'm going to be starting with a destination that holds a very special place in my heart, and that's the beautiful and fascinating and mysterious Easter Island. So I actually visited Easter Island back in 2014, about 3/4 of the way through a 6-month backpacking trip with my now husband, then fiance, and this was one of those once-in-a-lifetime locations that in reality was probably a bit outside of our budget at the time, but we also knew that we just could not skip it. So for anyone who isn't familiar with Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is a remote island that's located out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And when I say remote, I'm talking roughly 2,200 miles off the coast of Chile. So it's out there. And if the name doesn't ring a bell, you still might be familiar with the images of Easter Island because it's most famous for its iconic stone statues. Locally, they're known as Moai, but what they are is those large heads and torsos that you've likely seen on travel shows or in National Geographic carved from volcanic rock. And if you're still unsure what I'm talking about, then definitely take a moment to look them up now. Even without having to be specific, you can just search Easter Island, and I guarantee that those Moai heads will be the first thing that you see. But to circle back to budget, because the island is so remote, it can also be really expensive to get there. The only way to reach Easter Island is by plane, and flights leave only from Santiago, which is where we flew from. Tahiti has flights, and you can also fly from Lima, Peru, but flights are generally limited, so booking ahead of time is also a must if you want to guarantee your visit, and accommodations, especially in the higher season, are also limited, so planning ahead in general is just an overall good idea. So, like I said, we flew from the city of Santiago to Easter Island, and that flight was about 5 hours. And as you approach the island, it's honestly a little surreal coming up on it out of seemingly nowhere, and you get beautiful views of the coastline, and you can even see the Moai statues on your approach. So if it's a bucket list destination for you, I'm sure the excitement will just build and build the same way that it did for us, and it'll be so worth it. Now, for accommodations, we were definitely on a budget at that point. Like I said, we were there 3/4 of the way through our South America trip, so the flights themselves were really pricey. I can't quite remember what we paid, but I do know that they were the most expensive flights that we took during that trip. And we knew our expenses on the island were going to be quite a bit as well because obviously the island is so remote. So we did not stay anywhere super luxurious. We didn't go as far as to camp either though, even though that was an option that was available to us. But what we did was stay at a small guest house that was close to the airport with a small shared kitchen and a little hammock out on our patio. It was super cute. And it was really all that we needed. But if I was going to go back again and budget was no issue, I will say that I would definitely check out either the Hangaroa Eco Village and Spa or the Explora Rapa Nui. Every time I see travelers post from either of those hotels, I find myself like screenshotting the images and in my head planning like a next trip to Easter Island, even though I know that it's not in our plans anytime soon. But in addition to having all of the creature comforts that we could have needed at our guest house, we also had access to a really great little communal library area there. And so when we first arrived, I actually snagged a book from there that was all about Easter Island and its history, and sort of used that book as our guide as we went exploring on the island by quad or by 4x4. Different places call them different things, but we rented a quad to get around, and we found that to be the most convenient way to get from place to place on the island when we weren't just out walking. So one of the main draws of Easter Island is obviously the Moai. And one thing that surprised me the most was that these statues are actually found all over the island. So it's not like you just go and see them in one specific location. They're all over, and they vary in size from just a few feet tall to more than 30 feet tall. When I had initially done my research, which I'll admit was limited at the time, I did read that the majority of the Moai were located in Rapa Nui National Park, but it turns out that more than 40% of the island itself is designated national park. So if you're visiting Easter Island, then essentially Rapa Nui National Park is what you're visiting. And if you're wondering about the price, ticketing, that kind of thing, there is technically an entrance ticket, but what it is just one ticket to access all of the different sites that are on Easter Island. And that ticket is valid for, I believe, 10 days from the date of entry to your first site for, I believe, about $80 per person. I will leave a link to a resource in the episode notes so that if that changes from the time that I've been recording this, you'll have that up-to-date information to refer to in the planning process. But overall, either way, not too bad price-wise when you consider that everything that you're going to be doing or everywhere that you're going to want to be seeing will be covered under that ticket. And as beautiful as Easter Island is, generally you're not going to be staying for more than 10 days, so that would cover you for your entire stay. Now, the Moai statues on Easter Island are inarguably one of the most intriguing parts of the island, and almost the entire reason that I wanted to go there so badly. And the fact of the matter is that despite the fact that they were carved over 500 years ago, there are still so many unanswered questions about them, including what they represent and also how they were moved. So one theory about what they represent is that they were actually built to represent ancestors or important leaders of the Rapa Nui people, and that the statues are all different with their unique facial features and expressions because they're meant to represent specific people or specific figures from that time. But then another theory is that the Moai were built to protect the island from evil spirits and invaders and actually aren't representative of specific people at all. And this is all the kind of thing that I find so incredibly interesting, but beyond the reason for them being built, I have personally always been the most interested in the actual process of how they were carved and moved, because that really continues to be a subject of debate even now in the same way that people question how the pyramids were built. So the Moai themselves were carved from volcanic rock, and they were carved using stone tools with the largest statues weighing as much as 80 tons. So that's 80,000 kilograms? You might need to fact check that conversion, but either way, 80 tons, that's massive. And it's still not entirely clear how the Rapa Nui people were able to move these massive stones across the island to where they stand now, because they weren't carved in place. They were carved at a quarry in the national park and moved from there to various locations around the island. So one possibility is that the Moai were transported using a technique called walking the Moai, which is probably exactly how you would imagine it to be, where they would rock the statue back and forth on its feet. I'll call it feet, but they don't really have feet. And then use ropes and logs to move it forward. That said, though, the holes in that theory are the sheer size and weight that I just mentioned. Again, 80 tons is a massive undertaking to move and the Rapa Nui people didn't have access to modern tools at that time. And then there's also the island's terrain as well. Easter Island isn't a flat island, it's volcanic. It's hilly, so even if they did manage to find a way to walk these moai from one side of the island to the other, they'd be walking them through rugged terrain, which just doesn't seem all that feasible. So, as you can imagine, the question of how the Rapa Nui people moved the moai has been the subject of so much debate and speculation, but being there and seeing them in person and then knowing about this just makes them all that much more spectacular to see in the moment. But of course, seeing the moai is only one of the attractions on Easter Island, and there is quite a bit more to do there despite its smaller size. There are quite a few volcanic craters that you can visit there, and some with some pretty breathtaking views of the island and the ocean as well. And then the island also has some really beautiful beaches. We surprisingly didn't spend too much time enjoying the beaches while we were there. I think we had 1 or 2 beach stops, but for being such beach people, we were actually just so preoccupied at that point with the hikes and all of the other historical spots that we didn't leave that much time for rest and relaxation, honestly. But we did stop at a couple and we did breeze by a few, and definitely there is room for beaching and beautiful beaching if beaches are your thing and you're looking for somewhere to relax. It doesn't have to be all adventure all the time, so keep that in mind. And when we were out exploring, I would always be using the information in that guidebook that I stole from our guest house. I used it everywhere that we went. Now, obviously, this day and age, you would have a smartphone with whatever information that you needed on it, but the intention is the same. And I would really recommend, before visiting Easter Island specifically, that you do take a little more time than you normally would to read about the destination, read about the island and its history, because there are so many cool things that we would have completely missed the significance of, honestly, if I hadn't done that extra research and reading. I always think back to one of the days that we did a hike out across the island from where we were staying, and we were noticing all of these what almost looked like the openings of giant water wells, but they weren't like deep holes and they had grass or plants around them. And normally in situations like that, we would have just looked at these volcanic rock wishing wells and thought like, wow, that's really interesting. I wonder what that's about. Maybe make a note to Google it later. There were cows around, so maybe something to do with farming. Who knows, right? And then we would have just kind of moved on with our hike. But instead, I was there pulling out all of these facts about how they were used for gardening and to experiment with different agricultural practices, because the island itself at a certain point became a much more harsh environment for planting and growing food, as you can imagine. And that was something that was much needed because of how secluded they are from the mainland. And yeah, I won't go too deep into it all because that's an entirely different episode topic, honestly, but it just made that hike so much more interesting for me, having already read about it and then being able to identify those spots and those things, and then also being able to share that information with the person that I was out traveling with. And then one of the last kind of cool cultural experiences that we had on the island was to attend a traditional Rapa Nui dance performance. We went to a dance that was being put on in the community where we were staying, and it was super small, more of like a casual feeling event with locals, but these dances are meant as a way to celebrate Easter Island's cultural heritage, and they're just a really great way to experience the local culture firsthand as well. I've heard a lot of people actually compare the dances done on Easter Island to the cultural dances that you see in places like Hawaii or Tahiti, but I do want to take a quick moment to acknowledge that they're not the same. The traditional dance of Easter Island is called the Hako, I believe, but it's performed by both men and women and uses movements and hand gestures that tell stories about Easter Island's history specifically, as well as its culture and mythology. And the performers, while they do wear grass skirts, which is probably where that more superficial connection to Hawaii comes from, they also wear pretty distinctly different headdresses that are made from flowers and feathers compared to the traditional Hawaiian hula, which is primarily performed by women, or at least traditionally. And that dance is more, I want to say fluid, like the hand movements are more fluid and their dances tell stories about nature and daily life. And I think most of us are familiar with the grass skirts and leis that they wear. And then in Tahiti, it's a lot more like fast, hip shaking, energetic footwork and drums and percussion. The Tahitian dances were actually some of my favorites to watch when we were in Tahiti on our honeymoon. But yeah, what I'm getting at is the three are actually a lot more different than they're given credit for, I think. So I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge that here. All beautiful, but definitely different from each other. So before I wrap up this destination deep dive, I do want to share a couple of quick tips with you regarding planning a trip to Easter Island and making the most of your time there. The first is around visiting the Moai. If you're planning to visit the Moai, which I imagine that you would be, and you're a professional or Instagram or hobby photographer, I would recommend either getting up to go early in the morning or planning for later in the afternoon when the light is the softest. The midday light on the island can be incredibly harsh, and honestly, photography aside, it's just an overall more enjoyable experience to visit and view the statues without the dead heat and glaring sunlight in your eyes. So that's one thing to consider. And then the other is that if it's in your budget, consider hiring a local guide, even if it's just for your first day to get like a lay of the land. A local guide can provide you with insights into the island's history and culture that you likely wouldn't learn otherwise. And they can also take you to lesser known sites and explain to you a little bit more of the significance of the statues located in different locations. So that's going to be it for this episode of the Tips and Trips podcast and our first destination deep dive. Thank you so much for joining me on my walk down memory lane. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out and let me know. If you couldn't tell, there's nothing I love more than talking about travel. And don't forget to tune in next time for more exciting travel tips and destinations. And until I catch up with you then, stay great, travel safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Chat soon.